Throughout 1943, as the Army Air Force continued their buildup of bombers and missions over mainland Europe, the lack of fighter escort continues to lead to deadly consequences for the bomber boys of the 8th Air Force. As with anything, there are many reasons for this. However, what we will look at today is the development and deployment of the P51 Mustang and how it turned the tide of the air war over Europe. High-altitude bombing, in the ways that were planned in World War II, had simply never been done before, nor since for that matter. So decisions on the strategies of the bomber war were a theory on what would work and what would not. The theory that the US bomber leaders firmly believed was that the B-17 Flying Fortress could protect itself in long-range missions to bomb targets over Europe. The various gun positions, large crews in conjunction with other aircraft flying in tight formations would be able to protect itself against anything that the German Luftwaffe could throw at it. Now, history shows that this theory was debunked pretty quickly if you look at the mission logs and how many planes and crew members were continuously lost on deep penetrating missions. It is clear that the US bomber leadership held on to this belief for too long, but they did not have the luxury of reviewing things 80 years later like we do. Because of this theory, however, the development of a long-range fighter was near the bottom of the list in terms of development from the Army Air Force. Along with it being on the bottom of the list, there was still a limit in what technology was able to do. October 14, 1943 sent 291 bombers to Schweinfurt and lost 60 planes and over 1,500 crewmen. March 18, 1944 sent 1,250 bombers on a raid to Berlin and lost only 24 planes. What was the difference between these two missions that led to such staggering losses? In 1943, the U.S. Army Air Force mainly relied on the P47 Thunderbolt and P38 Lightning.
And now a snaky string of lightnings move.
While the RAF relied on the Spitfire and Hurricane. The P-47s were a heavy and robust fighter, however had a range of only 300 miles, as the addition of external fuel tanks were still being deployed. This meant that any mission outside of this range would have the P-47s escort the bombers only this far before turning back and heading home. The German fighters knew this and would wait for American fighters to hit their range and turn around, and then attack the bombers, who would be unprotected at this point. It wouldn't be until the fall of 1943 until the P-47s would add external drop tanks, which would increase their range by another 100 miles and allow them to at least enter Germany before having to turn around. P-38s did have a greater range, with a range of about 520 miles in the fall of 1943. However, there was limited aircraft in this theater, with the P-38 fighter being the star in the Pacific theater. As we move to October 8, 1943, the week of missions to Schweinfurt, Brentford, and Marienburg, the losses have become unsustainable for the 8th Air Force. With the loss of aircraft and crewmen being too much, the bomber mafia doctrine has to change. The deep missions into Germany are put on hold until they could get fighter escorts. This put many key targets out of the reach for the bombers. Enter the P-51 Mustang, originally designed with an Allison engine that caused power to drop off above 15,000 feet, making it unsuitable for missions over Europe. However, as RAF pilots continued to test the aircraft, the idea was presented to swap the Allison engine for a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which delivered increased horsepower above 25,000 feet. The engine change, which would eventually be built by Packard in the US, was revolutionary for the Mustang and now started to gain admirers in the United States Army Air Force. So by the end of 1943, the P-51B and P-51C variant Mustangs began to arrive in England, which was faster than the other Allied fighters, performed better at high altitudes, and most importantly had a range that could accompany the bombers throughout the missions to Germany. In conjunction with the new fighter to the 8th Air Force, a new commander in General Jimmy Doolittle immediately changed the tactics and the motto of the fighter groups in the 8th Air Force. In fighter command, there was a sign that read, "The fighter's job is to protect the bomber," to which Doolittle said, "The fighter's job is to destroy enemy fighters." This freedom to the fighters, who both the pilots and aircrafts were designed to be aggressive pursuit pilots, was a revelation to the pilots and squadrons. Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe during the war, was quoted as saying, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was over." Throughout 1943, 5% of downed American bombers were due to enemy fighters. In early 1944, with the introduction of the Mustang and new tactics, it decreased to 3.5%. And finally, from May to September of 1944, as the Allies gained air superiority, the number dropped to only 1.5%. After the fact, General Haywood Hansell would state, "Our doctrine was based on hope and not an existing fact."